and welcome to Sunshine for Your Life. Today I'm going to talk to you about Moses, and this is probably going to be the first of a two-part series of Moses and life in the desert, around that period of time when Moses was alive. Every so often in history, God raises up a special work that is so important that he calls special people to do it. And Moses was especially called of God to lead the people out of slavery into freedom. This is ancient history in Old Testament times. God trained him for this through his early education and his wilderness experiences. Now, what we don't stop to realize is lots of the experiences that we have lead us to be able to handle the experiences that are going to come in our future. God uses what we're going through as kind of training for the next thing that's going to happen in our life. So God spared no experiences necessary for Moses to do his task, and that is to release the prisoners from Egypt into freedom. The time in history was right. Moses was called to do that. And I believe that God prepares people for their experiences that they have and uses the experiences to prepare for them for what is next, as I have said before. Perhaps Moses' most difficult experience came at the point where he led his people across the Red Sea. The situation looked humanly impossible. There stood Moses, an ocean behind him, a group of hostile people. You know, the Jews were hostile toward their deliverer. They were hostile toward Moses. They wanted to go back to Egypt because they didn't want to be delivered. When things got tough, they wanted to give up their deliverance and go back to where they came from. So Moses is standing there with the ocean ahead of him, and the Red Sea, by the way, is a very, very wide sea. And he had the Jews who were hostile to him, and the Egyptians closing in, trying to recapture them again and bring them back. So he had some options. What would Moses have thought in a situation like that? Well, he could have had doubts and said that this was the end of the line and I wasn't really called to do this. Or he could have thought that God was punishing him for something, and the only reason I mention that is the fact that a lot of times when people go through things, they automatically think they're being punished for something. Most of the time, that is not true. But he might have had thoughts like that, but I don't think so. He could have thought that he had to retreat because they weren't going to be able to make it. He could have told his people to go back to the Egyptians. He could have had doubt, in other words. Or he could have decided to quit. I've got you this far. You're on your own. Good luck. Well, can you imagine the great person Moses was thinking or saying any of these things? And he wouldn't have, because he had such faith in God. So what Moses did, and to his great credit, he did none of those things and thought none of those thoughts which I have just mentioned. He made the decision to have faith and to expect God to come through, and he was not afraid and he was not disappointed. And God was faithful and gave instructions and encouragement to Moses. Now, the first verse I'm going to read comes from Exodus 14:13, and we'll have it on the screen. Now, this is what it says on the screen. I'm going to fill it in a little later. Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Let me read that again. Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Now, that's not the total verse, so now I'm going to read the whole thing, but the whole thing, of course, is not on the screen. It would be a little too long. It says this, same verse, do not be afraid, stand firm, you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. So he's giving them a promise. Don't be afraid, stand firm, God's going to deliver you, and you don't have to be afraid. And you see the Egyptians coming, that you're never going to see them again. We are going to be victorious. You will never see them again. All you have to do is to stand firm and let God deliver you. Now, I can imagine, and I can remember when I was first starting a Christian counseling service with a group of friends of mine, and we ran into all kinds of trouble, and this is natural when you're starting something new. And I use this verse with them to encourage them. Stand firm and watch what God will do today, because he will deliver us. All you have to do is be faithful. You have done what you can do. Just stand firm and let God take over. And of course, it always worked out for us. And we were able to establish a long-lasting Christian counseling center. But you sometimes need to remember the verses and the promises of God as you do a new adventure. Because if you don't, then you can get confused when trouble comes. Of course, the people did cross over the Red Sea successfully. Now, in today's world, we can learn a lot from Moses. He accepted his preparation with humility. How did God prepare him anyway to lead the people out of Egypt? Well, he put him through a set of experiences on his own. He learned from those experiences. They were like his education. And he was able to learn from that, so he never had any doubts that God would bring them through. He was prepared to do what he needed to do. He never fell into the mistake of feeling punished or feeling let down or wanting to quit or wanting to retreat. You know, there are a lot of wonderful, comforting things to be said that has been said in the scripture, and wonderful things that we can learn from Moses as he led his people into freedom. First, let's look at the characteristics of the Jewish people and the characteristics of God. The characteristics of the Jewish people, the Israelis, were that they grumbled all the time. In the process of being delivered, they grumbled. They wanted to be delivered to begin with. They couldn't stand their life in Egypt. They were treated very poorly. But they wanted, when the stress came, they thought of Egypt as being like home, and they wanted to turn back. So they grumbled. They wanted deliverance, but they didn't want to trust their deliverer. They didn't want to trust Moses. But Moses was trusting God, so it was safe to trust Moses. Their answer was to go back into slavery and to die in Egypt, which would have been a big mistake. Their major faults as people were that they grumbled against God, they grumbled against Moses, his servant, they did not accept his servant as their deliverer, they wouldn't cooperate with their own deliverance, and they ended up by preferring slavery to freedom when the opposition came. That would have been a big mistake for them to go back to Egypt. Nothing would have been changed, nothing would have been better, and it probably would have been a lot worse. Fearing to take the risk, they were feared to take a risk for freedom. Instead, they were willing to opt for slavery instead. Now, the second verse I'm going to put on the screen, and this is the Jews talking to Moses, and they're grumbling, but it's Exodus 14:12, and this is what it says. This is a short one, and I put on Jews speaking. These are the things that they were saying. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. Let me read it again. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. And in one verse, I don't have it on the screen, they said, Moses, we know why you brought us into the desert. You brought us into the desert to kill us. Now, of course, that was just fanciful thinking. That wasn't true. He brought him into the desert because God chose him to get his people out of Egypt and land them and give them freedom from the problems that they had in Egypt and to lead them toward the promised land. This is what was going on. Moses was obeying God and rescuing his people from the slave situation that they had to give them freedom. But when the opposition came and they had trouble, the first thing they wanted to do, let's go back to Egypt. At least we could eat there. Well, that was ridiculous. They wouldn't have starved. They had their flocks with them, you know. So they just didn't understand, and they got scared, and they just did not have the heart to go forward. So Moses had great faith. He knew that God would deliver them. And God's characteristic was that he was always faithful. The people grumbled. Moses was faithful, but the and God's characteristic was that he was always for them, and he always led them out safely, and he made sure that they were safe, and he completely provided for their needs. Now, God gave his people complete victory, and he parted the Red Sea, and he let his people escape, and then he drowned the Egyptians that followed him. Now, I know I've heard some people say to me when they tried to argue against what God wanted, they would say, well, you know, of course, it was only like a trickle. It was only like a little stream. But the Red Sea was a formidable sea. And if it had only been a little trickle or a brook or something, then the Egyptians wouldn't have been drowned in it when the Moses people made their escape. So let's take a look at the similarities between what happened in Moses' time and what happens to us today. We are living in a world of grumblers. If things aren't the way most people want it to be, the first thing they do is complain. And that complaining can cripple a church, it can cripple society, and a church, if it's in a church situation, the church can't do its ministry, what it's supposed to do, if everybody is complaining. So they need to get their heads together and stop complaining. Some Christians are on the fence. They prefer the world, like Egypt, than to have the freedom that Jesus can give, and only Jesus can give. Some Christians are not willing to go forward because it seems like it's too much of a risk. Well, if I go forward and do what I'm supposed to do, how do I know it's going to work out all right? How do I know my needs are going to be met? I've mentioned before about a friend of mine, actually a friend of my brother's, who was called to be a youth pastor and given the opportunity to go to a Bible study because, of course, to be a youth pastor, you would have to have credentials as a minister. But he became afraid. He didn't think he was going to meet his needs. He didn't have enough faith to realize God would open doors for him, even though he didn't know what doors they were. Sometimes you have to take what seems like a risk to get the benefits, because if God is calling you for something, he's surely not going to leave you hanging. He's going to be there for you. But he was too afraid. Now, this man drove a milk truck. And he would have to leave his job driving a milk truck and go ahead and go to Bible study, the Bible school, which is what he was supposed to do. But he refused the opportunity, and later he really regretted it because he would never become a youth pastor. He would never have a chance to go to a Bible college. And as a result of that, he spent many years just delivering milk from a truck. That's not exactly what God had in mind for him. That's not exactly what he wanted for himself. But he became paralyzed with fear, and he wouldn't move forward. He wouldn't take the risk. So sometimes you have to be willing to take what seems like a risk. It's really not a risk because God is in it. But it's going to feel like a risk to move ahead. If you don't do it, and if you don't move ahead, you're going to lose the opportunity. He was hoping that that opportunity would come back and he would make a different decision, but it never did come back. And many times it won't. You have that one-time opportunity that you need to seize upon it, knowing God is in it for you, instead of postponing it, saying no, and then you expect to have that opportunity again later, but it never comes. So some Christians are not willing to go forward. But for those of us who do go forward, we can expect victory because God is going to be faithful to us, just like he was faithful to Moses. God is going to completely meet your needs, just as he did for Israel. He's not going to leave you behind. And these include your needs for finances, for your physical healing, emotional healing, spiritual needs, and all other needs that you may have. We'll have to take the instruction as to what to do and when to do from God himself. And when we do that, he takes care of us. We go forth when we need to. We hold back when we need to. And the Israeli army, they had to wait and see what does God want you to do? Go forward or to go back? Well, he doesn't want you to go back, but he may want you to stay still a while until he calls you forward again. When we are harassed, we can expect the same protection as the Israelis had. We are required to have great faith. How can you move forward without faith? And we make the choice to do so. Moses had great faith, and he was allowed the privilege of helping and doing the deliverance which God wanted him to do. He delivered the people from the Egyptians. He delivered them from slavery. And so with God on our side, there is success despite the fact that we feel the risk. It may be very great. It doesn't matter what is great, whether it's great or not. God is in it. So even when the early church was persecuted, the gospel succeeded, the gospel was spread. There was suffering involved. There's always suffering involved. Sometimes we have to pay the price for being faithful. People don't often think of that. If you are moving ahead as God is directing you, you probably are going to have obstacles. You may have persecution leveled against you, but because God is in it, He uses it. He brings you through it, and that's what you have to remember. Don't be surprised if things go against you for a while. Don't be surprised from that. That doesn't mean that you're necessarily on the wrong road. It just means that there's resistance, because Satan certainly doesn't want you to be successful. So you have to be clear in your own mind. Is this something God wants me to do? As I push ahead, is this something God really wants me to do? And if you're sure of it and you know, and that's confirmed, and other people realize that it's true, then you go forward with it. And if you meet with obstacles, well, that's part of life. And God will get you through that, and then you'll be okay. There will be times when your back is to the wall. If you are a Christian and you're doing ministries, there's going to be a time when your back is to the wall, and there's going to be an ocean of trouble ahead of you, and you're not going to know which way to turn. But God's always going to show you which way to turn. And I'm going to read another verse here, but it's not going to be on the screen. It says this, and I've actually read part of it before. It comes from Exodus 4:13. Stand back and watch the salvation of the Lord, which He will work for you today. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be still. In other words, you've done what you can do. You stand still. Remember what we learned from the Israelis, and these are some of the things we can learn from the story that I've told you about Moses. The Jews were tested. We are also tested. The Israelis' needs were always met. Our needs are always met. God gave the Jews lessons of trust through their experiences, and God teaches us trust through our experiences as well. The Jews accused Moses, and we have times when other Christians may accuse us. The manna was sweet, that God fed them through the manna, and I'll be talking about that next time. The manna was sweet and delicious, and Jesus' promises are really wonderful promises because He's faithful. And the God who took care of the Israelis is the God who takes care of us. The Jews look backward instead of forward, and sometimes that happens with us. Sometimes we look backward when we should be looking forward. And in crisis, the Jews look to the world instead of to God. How many Christians do that? Well, I'll make it because of this, or I'll make it because of that, rather than I'll make it because God is going to help me with that. And the timing of the Israelis' miracles was precise and perfect. The timing of the things that God does for us is precise and perfect. He is there all the time, but when we need a miracle or we need something happening, it happens at exactly the right time. And when the Jews complained, they were really complaining to God about the fact that they weren't happy with God's care of them. How many times do we complain, even as Christians, when we have no business to complain, but to thank God for His deliverance? So very often when we grumble, we're doing, in a sense, the same thing that the Israelis did. God has given us ministries that are parallel to Moses' situations. The people are in bondage in this world. They're in bondage to their addictions, to their financial problems, to a whole host of other things. And the people of Israel were in bondage too. We tend to grumble. they grumbled. So we must be faithful to God's calling, just as Moses was faithful to the calling that was given to him, even when his experiences were difficult and hard to bear. Our experiences sometimes are difficult and hard to bear. Now, I'm going to read the third scripture, which will be on the screen, and it's going to be Hebrews 10, 35 and 36. And I'm going to read part of it and then read the rest of it. Excuse me. It says this: do not throw away your confidence. It will be richly rewarded. Do not throw away your confidence. It will be richly rewarded. Now, let me read the whole thing. Do not throw away your confidence. It will be richly rewarded. You need to persevere so that when you have done the will of God, you will receive what he has promised. And this is a promise. We need to do the will of God, and God has promised things for us, and he will deliver on those promises. So we can have a very happy life. All we have to do is to remember that God is with us at all times. So I'm going to close it here. We'll be doing a second part to this next time. Please join me then.